11. Party Piece. To Ace's surprise, Gilgamesh's palace was nowhere near as grungy as she had feared. Uruk looked similar to Kish, a city with walls next to a stream and about the same size. A bridge led across the river to the main gateway, where winged lions carved from imported stones stared down at her. The roads were wide and astonishingly clean, trees were planted in the streets and squares, and the buildings were in good repair. To her eyes, the oddest thing was that there were no windows in the buildings. She mentioned this to Avram, who smiled. "It is for privacy, lady," he explained. "Each house is built about a central open courtyard, and the windows let onto this. It would be unseemly for a family to allow themselves to be overlooked by the most casual of passers-by, would it not?" Ace remembered the rows of windows in Perivale, all looking out onto the road and all protected by frilly nylon curtains. "You may have a point," she agreed. In the centre of the town, a huge ziggurat stood. This was a stepped pyramid rising over 200 feet into the air, with a temple atop it. It had 7 levels, each with a walkway leading around the entire structure, and with altars on every level. People swarmed all over it. The edifice dwarfed all of the other buildings, including the royal palace, which was a mere 2-story building, albeit built on a grand scale. The guards at the city gates had alerted the Council of Nobles to the return of Gilgamesh as soon as the party had been sighted approaching the city. Several of the nobles appeared as Gilgamesh led the way to the palace, and they fell on their faces in the street. It didn't do anything for their clothing, since the roads were not particularly dry. Obviously pleased with his reception, Gilgamesh reached down to touch one of the prostrate nobles. "Get up, Inartum," he said with mock severity. "I trust all has been well since I left." Ace didn't like the shifty look on Inartum's bearded features. Despite his oily words, he didn't seem overjoyed to see his king return. "Lord," the advisor said, rubbing his hands together, "the city prospers and all rejoice that you have returned safely. A feast is being prepared." "Good," Gilgamesh said dismissively, striding on towards the palace. The guards fell in about him, and the growing procession continued. Glancing about, Ace saw another of the nobles, a short, fat man who struggled hard to keep up. He seemed as white as a sheet, and she wondered why. Didn't he like Gilgamesh? Well, she couldn't blame him. The king was certainly a royal pain in the backside. It seemed odd. Then it clicked. Gilgamesh had been ambushed as he had tried to enter Kish, and someone must have told the Kishites to expect him. With a wicked grin, she made her way to the tubby traitor and nudged him in the ribs. "Oi," she said softly, "who rattled your cage? Surprised to see the king back, are you? Didn't think he'd make it?" The man stared at her and almost fainted from terror. "Bingo. Hit it in 1, she grinned at his terror. "Chill out," she said. "If he's too thick to notice what's going on, I won't tell him." She sauntered on, leaving the stunned traitor to his own terrified thoughts. Enartum had seen Ace approach Gudea, and the fool's ashen face had spoken volumes. Why couldn't he mask his emotions? The girl, whoever she was, didn't glance at him, so he was safe for now. It was obvious, though, that it was time to dispose of Gudea before he blabbed. Avram stared around curiously. He'd never been in Uruk before, but it looked like a wealthy city. A musician might make a good living here, he mused, especially if an idea he'd been mulling over bore fruit. He smiled encouragingly at Engula. She looked pale. She had been brought up in Kish to look upon the inhabitants of Uruk as murderers and rapists at best. This trip was merely the lesser of 2 terrifying evils for her, despite Gilgamesh's assurances of royal protection. Both Avram and Engula knew that kings have notoriously short and fickle memories. As for the doctor, his thoughts were his own. He fingered the devices he had slipped into his pockets after the midnight trip into the TARDIS and hoped that his conclusions were correct. So far, all the evidence pointed the same way. They arrived at the palace. Guards threw wide the main doors, and Gilgamesh strode in, regally ignoring everyone who threw themselves down in his path. He made his way directly to the throne room and collapsed into his throne. "Right," he said when everyone was gathered around. "First I'm taking a bath and oils. Then I want a feast. After that, Doctor, you and I will talk with my council and lay our plans. Inatum, see to it that the doctor and his friends have one of the royal sweets. They'll need to refresh themselves before the feast too. And get them some clean clothes. Well, what's everyone waiting for? Get to it! He clapped his hands and a whirlwind of activity began. Ace was escorted away by a couple of servants, who were measuring her up even as they walked alongside her. She saw the doctor and Avram taken through one set of doors, and she and N'Gula were politely but firmly ushered through another set. She looked about the room, torn between mortification and amusement. It was a bit different from her old bedroom in Perivale. The stone walls were broken only by small, high windows. Light was provided by reed torches soaked in foul-smelling bitumen set in holders at intervals on the walls. There were 2 low beds covered in furs and a coarse kind of cloth. Instead of pillows, there were wooden blocks. A few chairs and small tables were scattered about the room, most carved into uncomfortable-looking animal designs. Panthers and antelopes seemed to be the favourite themes. N'Gula seemed equally to be stunned by all of this. "Such luxury," she whispered, staring about her. Ace snorted. "If you'd like this lot, you'd love Perivale," she grinned. The girl stared at her. "Is Perivale the home of the gods?" she asked. Ace was momentarily lost for words. She replied carefully, "Not exactly. More like the back end of nowhere. But compared to this pad, even a council flat is luxury." N'Gula shook her head. "I do not understand you." "Don't worry," Ace told her. "Sometimes I don't understand myself." "Oi, what are you doing?" she demanded as one of the servants started to tug at her jacket. "Preparing you for your bath," the young girl replied, bowing low. "Well, keep your hands to yourself," Ace snapped. "I don't need any help to take a bath." She had to admit, though, that after the events of the previous night she felt that it would be lovely to lie back and soak in a tub. N'Gula shook her head slightly. "Lady," she said, "I do not know how it is where you come from, but here you must allow them to help. It is their duty." Glancing around at the 4 young girls, Ace shook her head firmly. "Push off," she told them as kindly as she could. "Just point me to the bath and I'll handle it myself." She obviously wasn't getting through to them. Trying again, N'Gula explained, "Aya, these girls have been ordered by the king to help you. If they do not, he might have them executed." "What?" Staring at the servants, Ace realised that the priestess was telling the truth, and she wouldn't put it past that regal loony to kill the girls either. Sighing, she held out her arms. "Okay, be careful with the jacket, or I might save Gilgamesh the trouble of killing you." Though N'Gula was more used to serving than being waited on, as the king's favoured guest she too submitted to the ministrations of the serving maids. She and they were equally amazed at both the quantity and kind of clothing that Ace wore. After they had fussed over her underwear and sneakers long enough, Ace yelled at them to get on with the bath. Ace had expected a good soak in a tub. She was disappointed. 2 of the girls brought in what looked like the type of old tin bath she'd heard pensioners talk about using in front of their fires half a century before she was born. Standing in one as she was directed, Ace gave a shriek as a bucket of cold water was tipped over her head. "Grief!" she finally managed, teeth chattering. "Don't you heat the water here?" The chief serving girl looked puzzled. "Whatever for, lady?" "Well, I think you'd live longer with less shocks like that," Ace managed to say before a second pail was tipped over her. Spitting out cold water, she flinched as 2 of the girls began to scrape at her with what looked like butter knives. "Oi! What are you doing?" "Cleansing you, lady," the maid explained. "Just pass me the soap," Ace complained. "Soap?" The rest of the bath was no less like a nightmare. After the maids had scraped her skin almost raw, they tipped 2 more buckets of ice-cold water over her. While she was still shivering, they attacked her with rough towels that virtually finished the job of removing all her skin. Then they brought in 2 vases, filled with some oozy liquid that smelled like a department store perfume counter after an elephant had trampled on all of the bottles. "Don't tell me that's the shampoo," she protested. "I'm not having that stuff in my hair." "What? Women must have a pleasing aroma, lady," the servant explained. It charms their men. Well, it doesn't charm me, Ace protested. I'll smell like a walking antiperspirant spray if you throw that stuff on me. Puzzled, Angula asked, Does the doctor not like you to be scented? I don't care what he likes, Ace said firmly. I do as I please. This confused the maids and the priestess. The king, the doctor, and a seemingly endless queue of suitors featured in the babble of protestations. Oh, get on with it, she finally sighed to shut them up. Looking relieved, the girls began to massage the oil into Ace's skin. Once the shock of the powerful aroma wore off, Ace had to admit that it felt rather nice, sort of like a good massage, she supposed. Her raw skin was cooled by the oils, and she decided she could get used to the smell eventually. She drew a line at the clothing, however. They bought her only 2 pieces of cloth and a pair of sandals. What's this? She demanded. Your robe, lady, the maid told her. Ace regarded the scraps of purple cloth. I've got bikinis more respectable than that, she told them, regardless of the fact that they couldn't possibly understand her. She marched back to the other room, trailed by the wailing servants. I'll wear my old gear again. It would be a great insult to the king, the chief maid cried, with tears streaming down her cheeks. He selected your clothing himself. That explains it, Ace said. He's a sex maniac. The maid seemed distraught at the idea of her ignoring a command from the king. Unwilling to cause the girls more worry than she had to, she agreed to try the outfit on. It was as skimpy as she had feared. The smaller cloth was wound about her hips, roughly in the place of her knickers. The main cloth was draped about her shoulders, like the saris her friend Manisha used to wear, and pinned in place by a very ornate gold brooch. No way, she decided firmly. Too much leg showing, and definitely not enough protection against Gilgamesh and his wandering hands. She stripped down again, and in spite of the protests of the maids, she pulled on her old underwear and her jeans. Then she had them redrape the sari over that. She eyed her jacket, but reluctantly decided to leave it. To the wailing maid, she said, It's this, or I don't go to the feast. The king will not be pleased, Angula commented. She herself wore a white version of the sari, and although her legs were bare, her breasts were covered for the first time since Ace had met her. Stuff the king, Ace commented. For a moment she thought the servants were going to faint, but they managed to pull themselves together. Ignoring them, Ace grinned at her companion. You're looking more dressed now. Angula glanced down. It would be unseemly to pose as a priestess of Ishtar in the palace of the king of Uruk, she explained. Come off it, laughed Ace. He'd love it. And he might leave me alone if you were flaunting your boobs in his face. You do not like his attentions? Asked Angula, puzzled. Right on, Ace agreed. But it is an honour, the girl tried to explain. To be the paramour of a king is to be especially blessed. Ace snorted. Then I'll bet Gilgamesh has blessed every woman in the city at least once. He's just not my type. This concept was obviously beyond the grasp of the young priestess. Ace decided to give up. I'll just skip this honour, she said. Now, how about looking for that feast? I'm famished. I could eat a horse. Something dawned on her. Hey, what do they serve for food here? Not really a horse, I hope. Angula shrugged. Probably roast birds, cornbread and the like. The king eats very well. There may even be meats and real bread. Ace raised her eyes to heaven. I'll never complain about Perivale again, she muttered. I'm dying for a bacon butty. Ishtar regarded the fragments on the table in front of her with interest and wary curiosity. They were all the scraps that the guards had been able to find from the wreckage of the device that had caused the damage to the temple rooms. An explosive of some kind, she mused, her tail swishing back and forth on the hard stone floor. Bits of aluminium and a nitrogen-based compound. She switched off her analysing scanners and swept the pieces to the floor with her hand. Quite obviously beyond the abilities or imagination of your primitive humans, she told Dumuzi. He was waiting, servile as ever, just inside the doorway. She spun about to glare in his direction again. Yet I do not think either the man or the woman you saw were from Upnapishtim's coven of cowards. She forced his mind to return to the images of the pair. "The girl," said Ishtar thoughtfully. "Now she could be from my world. She looks considerably more lively and interesting than your pallid race, Dumuzi. She would make me a fine servant, or a tasty feast." She brought the image of the man to the front of the high priest's mind next. "Strange clothing, strange manners," she said softly, "and he somehow managed to resist the effects of the drug he was given. He cannot be one of Utnapishtim's lackeys. They would not have the ability he displayed." "Lady?" asked Dumuzi, grimacing in pain as the memories were ripped from his mind. "I do not understand. Did you not say that no one from your home was left alive after you poured out your wrath upon them?" She released the link almost contemptuously. "I do not expect you to understand. I expect you only to obey." She glared at him. "And there may have been a few who survived my wrath. It is nothing to you." Recovering from the attack, he managed a short bow. "This Utnapishtim that you speak of, he is your foe?" Laughing in derision, Ishtar stared down at her priest. "Dumuzi, never forget that I can read your every little thought. Oh, don't be afraid. I shan't punish you for daring to hope that Utnapishtim might come to destroy me and free you. Leaving you the dream and desires for freedom amuses me." She glanced inwards. "But even if Utnapishtim lives, he believes me dead, little man. And by the time he discovers otherwise, I shall be far too strong for him to defeat me. No, place no hopes in him." She smiled again and raised his chin with her metal hand, her red eyes burning directly into his. "I'll tell you what. If you want to maintain those foolish fantasies about getting free of me, try placing them in the hands of that stranger who was here. I tell you this, Dumuzi, he has a better chance of defeating me than Utnapishtim. That worm is dead, or if he lives I will crush him when it suits me. This other, though, he is an unknown force. He clearly has unusual powers. Dream on with him as your hero, foolish priest." Laughing to herself, she moved back into her sanctum and left Dumuzi to wonder. To Ace's surprise, the feast was not the torture session she had expected. The hall had been prepared with a dozen long tables arranged in a square about the walls, leaving the centre of the room empty. The tables were all ornamental, their legs carved in the form of humans and animals which were holding up the tabletops on their arms or shoulders. They were inlaid with the bright blue of lapis lazuli, and even jade or some other green stone that she didn't know. The plates and cups were mostly of silver, except the set for Gilgamesh, which was of pure gold. Finger bowls abounded, Ace noticed, but the only utensils were knives. Behind each of the tables were cushions, soft and comfortable. The tables were low, and Engula explained that the guests would lie on their sides on the cushions to eat. Though she would have preferred a chair, Ace decided she could play along with this style of eating for a change. She was glad that she had insisted on wearing her jeans, though. Laying down in a short skirt would definitely have been asking for trouble. Didn't the local women have any notion of modesty? Or, with Gilgamesh about, of safety? The maid showed both girls and the other arriving guests to their places. Ace was placed at the end of the largest table, next to the doctor, who didn't look as if his skin had been scraped, and who had obviously insisted on wearing his old clothes. He'd even brought his umbrella along with him. He'd clearly won all the arguments with the servants about changing. He had a way of doing things like that which she envied. To Ace's disappointment, both Engula and Avram were placed at a table at the far end of the room. Seeing her wave forlornly to them, the doctor smiled. "It's a matter of status, Ace," he explained quietly. "You and I are honoured guests, and thus allowed to eat at Gilgamesh's table. Avram's just a musician, and Engula is just a defrocked priestess. The local hierarchy probably didn't even want her here, so they have to be seated as far away from the nobles as possible. I'm surprised they were allowed in at all, if it's just a matter of having the right name and enough gold thread in your robes." Ace hated the attitudes that dictated the seating arrangements. She wanted to be with people she liked, regardless of their status. "I think it's because Gilgamesh doesn't want to offend us," the doctor told her. "Otherwise, I'm sure they'd have to forage for food in the kitchen. It pays to have connections, eh, Professor? He winked at her. The entertainment began. There were court musicians playing crude wind instruments, drums and harps. There were dancers, conjurers and acrobats. There were trained monkeys juggling nuts and bright baubles. All of this went on almost unnoticed as the food was served and eaten. To Ace's relief, Gilgamesh had taken his place at the centre of the table, with Enkidu on his right. The oily advisor, Enatum, lounged next to Enkidu. On Gilgamesh's left was a pretty woman with an extremely well-developed chest. The king didn't bother Ace all evening, but he laughed a lot and pawed the woman frequently. She, in her turn, was clearly enjoying the attention, and with obvious delight fed Gilgamesh little delicacies as his hands roamed inside her robes. "Thank God for small mercies," Ace muttered to the doctor. "Who's she, the queen?" "No." The doctor's face was perfectly blank. "She's the wife of Gudea." He nodded in the direction of the fat man that Ace had enjoyed scaring earlier. "What?" Ace spluttered. "And His Randy Majesty is filling her up in public. Don't they have any laws in this town?" "Of course they do," the doctor chided her. "This is a civilization after all. But don't forget that it is Gilgamesh who makes the laws here." "Oh." She watched the king as he bobbed for grapes down the woman's dress. Both of them were quite obviously enjoying themselves. Gudea, equally obviously, was not. Ace began to appreciate the hidden emotions that could drive a man to betray even a successful king. "It doesn't seem right to me." "I didn't say it was right, Ace," the doctor sighed. "But in this culture it's considered acceptable. Gilgamesh is a warrior king and a hero by anyone's count. Because of his strength, Uruk is one of the greatest powers in the known world. If he feels like fooling about with the wives and daughters of the nobles, well, they may not like it, but to them it's a small price to pay. To them, the king is almost divine. She probably feels it's an honour to gain Gilgamesh's attentions." "Sounds pretty sick to me," Ace replied. "If he wants to keep his fingers intact, he'd better keep them well away from me." The doctor regarded her sadly. "Ace, these trips of ours are supposed to broaden your mind. Stop thinking in 20th century terms for a while and try to see these people through their own eyes. I know you don't like Gilgamesh, but by the standards of this time he's actually quite a decent chap. That's because they have low standards. At least they have standards." He shook his head. "I've been to times and places in which Gilgamesh would look like a veritable angel." He winced as the king let loose a loud belch. "And others where he would be flayed alive for behaviour like that. It's not just the TARDIS that has relative dimensions, Ace, but the societies that we visit too." Ace shrugged. She didn't agree, but there was no point in arguing with the doctor. She tried the food, which proved to be filling but fairly bland. There were few herbs or spices used in the cooking. The meat dishes, mostly birds with some pork and scrawny beef, were all roasted. Flat slabs of warm bread were served, and there were several sorts of vegetable soup. This was clearly considered to be five-star catering. Ace tried to decide whether she had ever eaten better food in school. Some of the canteen meals had been only one step up from pig swill. It took her a while to get the hang of eating these dishes, since there were no spoons. Bowls of the steaming soups or stews would be placed in front of every 3 or 4 guests, who would break off pieces of bread and use them to dunk with vegetables or chunks of meat. Ace wasn't too keen on sharing her dishes with the other guests, given the standards of hygiene practised here, but there wasn't any choice. After a few tries, she managed quite well. The finger bowl, she noticed, got quite a lot of use. With no towels to hand, the diners simply wiped their wet fingers on their clothing. It wasn't surprising that Gilgamesh's robe was getting quite stained. There were plenty of fruits around, and she stuck mostly to those. The grapes, apples and pears were all tasty, but the oranges were bitter. On the other hand, she realised that bananas and pineapples, her own favourites, had not yet been discovered in Mesopotamia. For drink, there was either the foul barley beer, quaffed in large quantities by the men, or a sort of watery red wine. Ace stuck to the latter, though she was by no means fond of it. The lesser of two evils, really. She wished that tea or coffee had been discovered, or even a bit of carbonated water. Finally, when the feasting was done, Gilgamesh straightened, removed his hands from wherever they had been on Gudea's wife's anatomy, and clapped loudly. The chatter that had permeated the room ceased, and everyone looked at the king. "Friends," he said loudly, "Enkidu and I have returned from a rare adventure. Chancing our lives, we went on a spying expedition into Kish." There was quite a tumult of applause at this, people banging their fists enthusiastically on the table. Whether they liked Gilgamesh or not, they knew how to stay on his good side. "Toadies!" Ace shouted. The doctor glared at her. "We learned much there," the king continued, beaming happily at the applause, "and we were joined on that adventure by two of the gods themselves, Ea and Aya." He gestured at the doctor and Ace. Again there was applause. "He makes us sound like a double act on the telly," Ace complained under her breath. Still, she had been half terrified that the crowd would bow down and start worshipping them or something. She'd never have managed to keep a straight face if they had. "And we also met with a new songsmith," Gilgamesh said. "Since he's accepted our hospitality tonight, I think it's about time he paid for his food, eh?" There was a general roar of approval at this, and Avram rose to his feet, clutching his harp. Moving to the centre of the room, he struck a chord, and quiet fell. "My Lord King," he said formally, "lords, ladies, I am indeed honoured to be allowed in such distinguished and noble company. I am eager to perform for your entertainment. Is there any song that you might like to hear?" "Yes," the doctor called out before anyone else could speak. "I'd like to hear the one about Utnapishtim if you don't mind." "A new song?" Gilgamesh asked, surprised. "Well, Ea, if you like. Then he can sing about Ishtar and the 7 drunken nights, eh?" The woman next to him sniggered and whispered something in his ear that made him roar with laughter. "Later, you bawdy thing. Music first." Avram bowed to the king and again to the doctor. Striking another chord, he began. His song consisted mostly of chanted lyrics, with the harp being used for emphasis rather than accompaniment. Silence fell over the hall as Avram span his song for them.